From the bus stop in Pallantrow Cemetery to the vaulted muralled ceilings of the derelict Peacock Brewery. From the Courty Barrow roundabout in Highgate to the sunrise vistas of the Kirby estate in Walthamstow. Broadcasting from a canal barge adrift on the current, one Thames bend east of Tower Bridge. This is London, building by building. A scattershot dive into the architectural past and present of the English capital, undertaken one building at a time. I am your guide, Sam Redlark. Today we will look at the caged tableau of the Garden of Eden at St Lidwina's church in Holborn. We will also briefly examine similar examples found in other churchyards elsewhere in the capital. This episode is sponsored by Bagstaff's Library Guard Sun Sealant. Prevent sun fading to book spines with this easy-to-apply waxed-based coating made from a blend of 5 different shellfish oils. Bagstaff's Library Guard Sun Sealant is an invisible and completely odourless treatment, providing guaranteed protection against 96% of all scientifically catalogued paper-eating beetles. Unlike other leading wax sealants, it also adds strength to page bindings. Extend the lifespan of your home library with Bagstaff's Library Guard Sun Sealant. Or for the professional, why not try Bagstaff's Library Guard Plus, developed in partnership with the British Library. Now with our patented plankton essence formula for better results when uncreasing and smoothing out dog-eared pages. Bagstaff's Library Guard Sun Sealant, the preferred sun sealant of the dedicated bibliophile. What is this gnarled and creeping vestige of old-growth forest, sequestered from the world inside a steel cage? This piecemeal thicket, this crooked remnant of a sainted grove. Who are the 2 pale inhabitants, sometimes glimpsed among the branches? What is the significance of the horned creature, who stalks them from the shadows, and the glistening piles of red berries that it so diligently harvests? A couple of weeks ago, I happened to bump into Perry Tipper in the otherwise deserted carriage of a westbound District Line train. We rode together for several stops. He asked me what I had been doing with myself. I mentioned to him the architectural surveys that I had been carrying out on behalf of the Unified Wells and Aquifers Company. Perry inquired whether I had ever had any cause to examine the caged tableau of the Garden of Eden, which is to be found on the northern exterior wall of St Lidwina's church in Holborn. No, should I? I responded. I would have thought that kind of thing would be right up your street, he replied. Anyway, I should go soon if you want to see it, as I hear that there are plans to remove it while the outside of the church is being cleaned. Afterwards it is to be relocated in the vicarage garden, where it will be inaccessible to the general public. St Lidwina, who is also known as St Lidwina of Schiedam, was a 15th century Dutch mystic. She is the patron saint of ice skaters, an undemanding role in London, where your only venerators are likely to be Winter Olympians and players in the elite ice hockey league. These mainstays are supplemented in December by a trickle of novices who are about to take their first faltering steps onto one of the capital's temporary skating rinks. Lidwina, who was one of the first documented cases of multiple sclerosis, doubles as a patron saint of the chronically ill. The church hosts support groups for the sufferers of various long-term incurable conditions. Most of these groups convene at the community hall around the corner, partway along Underhay Passage, formerly an alleyway that was reclaimed from the surface archaeology and widened into a road during the slum clearances of the late 1800s. A few days after my chance meeting with Perry, I telephoned St Lidwina's and spoke to a woman named Agnes Swan, who is joint head caretaker at the church, a position she job shares with another woman named Sylvia Kettle. Both are in the early stages of multiple sclerosis. When I tentatively asked her whether there was some kind of Garden of Eden sculpture in the grounds of the church, she graciously confirmed its existence. I'm told that it's attached to the outer wall of the church, but I am not altogether clear what it is, I said. I assume some kind of wood or stone carving. It's a miniature garden in a long cage, she replied. If you drop by around 11 on Tuesday, in exchange for a small donation to the church, I can give you a guided tour. We set the date. After I had put the phone down, I made a note of the appointment on the wall calendar in the kitchen and paperclipped a £20 note, withdrawn from the holiday funds jar, to the bottom of the page. On Monday afternoon, it snowed persistently for several hours. When I closed the curtains in my room before going to bed, the night sky was teeming with large, gently cascading flakes that fused together during their slow descent. They made a soft, wet patter against the painted window ledge that I could hear through the single sheet of thin glass. In the morning, a bus journey, undertaken in 2 stages, followed by a short walk through the white fog breath of my fellow post-rush hour commuters, brought me to the fringes of Holborn. At St Lidwina's, an anonymous rosy-cheeked figure, swaddled in a waist-length navy blue puffer anorak, with the hood pulled up over their woolen hat, was in the midst of clearing the narrow, fixed gravel pathway that borders the walls of the church. "Agnes?" I called. As I made my way towards her, the pristine snow, compressed underfoot, made a sound like fingers scrunching the skin of a balloon. She pulled down the red scarf that had been wound several times around her neck and the lower portion of her face. "Sylvia," she replied. "Are you Mr. Redlark?" "Yes, that's me." "Agnes is unwell, I'm afraid. She sent her apologies. She asked me to show you around on her behalf. I'll do my best to impart the breadth of her knowledge." Removing one of my gloves, I proffered a damp £20 note, which he regarded quizzically. Agnes mentioned a donation for the upkeep of the church. "Oh, good heavens, yes. It's probably for the best if you put that through the front door on your way out. There's a secure letterbox on the right. Any money that we find there goes into the collection." Abandoning her shovel against the wall, she led me around the perimeter of the building. The upright tombstones were shrouded in deep snow. They looked as if they had put on ghost costumes. A set of slightly overlapping leg prints traversed the cemetery to and from the statue of an angel who was standing vigil over a grave with their head bowed. One raised stone hand held aloft a set of carved scales that were weighing a pair of perfectly spherical snowballs, the pan on the right having been deemed the heavier of the two by the preemptive logic of the sculptor. Sylvia came to a halt next to an unsightly patched steel box that was mounted at the foot of the long north wall, a few inches clear of the church foundation. I ignored it at first, thinking that it was some kind of heating vent. It was only after she announced, "Well, here we are," that I gave it closer scrutiny. The casing was around 5 feet long, perhaps 2 feet high, and I would have thought no more than 6 inches deep. Behind a sheet of square wire mesh, a wintry diorama of gnarled trees, with bare, snow-laden branches, emerged at a slant from a landscape of frosty dunes. A tatty old strip of dimly patterned burgundy-coloured carpet, laid down at the foot of the tableau, was well on its way to merging with the wet dirt that had been tracked across it. "To see the Wood of Eden, one must kneel," said Sylvia Kettle. Trembling slightly, and leaning on the wall for support, she awkwardly manoeuvred herself down onto her knees. Somewhat reluctantly, I joined her. The carpet was as muddy and as soaked through as it looked, and made an unpleasant squishing sound as I settled my weight upon it. Sylvia, who was wearing thick, waterproof salopettes, was presumably less uncomfortable than I was in my jeans. "I don't really understand the significance of what I am looking at," I said. "You're seeing it in its dormant period," said Sylvia. "This is a living representation of the story of the Garden of Eden, told over the course of a year. We're almost at the end here. The trees that you can see are a yew, a pair of oaks. At the back there's a small elm that didn't take root properly. There's some fissures in the church wall they like to exploit. The most important member of the group is this one here, the tawny holly." She pushed the magenta tip of her gloved finger into a square in the mesh, pointing towards a set of gnarled, barren branches. "The holly is deciduous?" I queried. "Yes, unusual, isn't it, for a holly bush? The cuttings were taken from St Arthur's Grove in Glastonbury on the morning of the 1st of January. They were planted here the same day. You can think of them as our version of bonsai trees. Unlike their eastern counterparts, here in the West, they are raised for Christmas, like turkeys. If you'd visited the garden a week from now, after the winter equinox, there would be nothing here at all. Agnes and I will harvest the trees on the morning of the 22nd. Afterwards, pieces of the branches are worn, attached to clerical robes, over the Christmas and early New Year period. On the first Sunday after Epiphany, they are gathered together in a dead bouquet and carried smouldering through the church to the altar, where they are extinguished in the font, while a prayer of atonement is recited. So, what happens before all that, in the spring and summer?" I inquired. "Well, this is the really interesting bit, that unfortunately you've missed," she said. "The berries on the tawny holly begin to emerge in early February. Then on the first day of Lent, we allow Satan to enter the garden. That role is played with great conviction by a devil's coach horse beetle. Have you ever seen one?" I shook my head. "They're nasty-looking creatures. They bend their abdomens back over their bodies like scorpion tails." "So, the devil is in the garden, almost at the beginning?" I interjected. "Even before Adam and Eve?" "Yes," replied Sylvia. "It's controversial in theological circles. It isn't until the afternoon of Easter Sunday that we introduce our versions of Adam and Eve to the garden, in the form of 2 natto due volte caterpillars. We order several through the mail from a breeder in Cambridge, so we have plenty of stand-ins should anything go awry. The caterpillars are poisonous to the beetle. However, there is a chemical in the holly berries that temporarily neutralizes the toxins when they are eaten by the larvae. So the devil begins his thankless work, laboriously harvesting the berries and piling them up as offerings to the caterpillars. But the caterpillars won't eat the berries. There is something about them that they don't like. Too bitter, I think. This stalemate continues until the autumn rolls around and tips the balance in the devil's favour. It's mating season for the beetles, you see. They begin to produce a sugary resin from a gland in their tail, which they use to coat the berries. This is the clincher for the caterpillars, who cannot resist it. They crawl out from wherever they've been hiding and dine on the forbidden fruit. After that, there is a very tense 24 hours, where the caterpillars are edible and have to avoid being eaten until they can use the energy they've gained from their feast to form chrysalises. We let the beetle go at this point to avoid any mishaps. The butterflies emerge in early to mid-October and are ritually cast out of the garden. There used to be a small ceremony that would take place. These past few years, since the Reverend Hayden took over the parish, it's been left to me and Agnes to unlock the lid and let them go free. They are beautiful butterflies for this time of year, marbled grey, like fragments of an overcast sky. My knees were damp and were beginning to ache. As I began to rise, Sylvia placed a hand lightly on the crook of my elbow, pausing me in mid-crouch. There are some other features. Oh, but you can't see any of it, what with all the snow. Would you mind giving me a pull-up? I took hold of her arm and raised her to her feet. Under her thick winter clothes, she was very frail and thin. She seemed to weigh almost nothing. I wondered where the energy came from to clear the pathways around the church. There are a few simple mechanics that respond to changes in the environment, she said. There are some small mirrors. You can adjust their angle by turning screws on the side of the casing. When the sun is in a certain position, they create shafts of light. We try to get them so they converge on the tawny holly, or on the mounds of berries. I absently drummed my knuckles up and down the storm-coloured metal roof of the garden, like God unleashing rolling thunder over a cross-section of his creation. This frame is modern, obviously. Yes, it's about 6 years old, I think. Up until the Second World War, they were wooden and were put together by the parishioners. Quite a lot of work went into making them. They were broken up and burned along with the rest of the garden in early January. After the war, they installed one that was made out of bronze. Agnes remembers it. Even with all the tarnish and wear to the metal, it was too nice a thing to be kept outside, really. She said one day she arrived at the church to find it gone, crowbarred off the wall. It's probably a conversation piece in somebody's home now. The current frame is deliberately ugly. Nobody's going to want to take it. I heard there are plans to move it to the vicarage garden, I said. What I could see of Sylvia's dark eyebrows, under her hat and hood, raised themselves expressively. That would appear to be the case. They're going to undertake repairs to the exterior of the church in the spring. When everything is fixed, the outer walls are going to be cleaned, so we will have to remove the garden while all of that's going on. The Reverend Hayden has made it known that he doesn't want it to return to the church after the restoration work is finished. He says that he finds it a little too pagan for his tastes. As a compromise, he has said that he will move it to the small garden at the back of the vicarage, though heaven knows where he will put it. It might just end up in the storage shed, with all the other stuff that we've taken out of the church through the years. The Garden of Eden at St Lidwina's is not the only one of its kind in London, though for the time being, at least, it remains the most centrally located. Similar gardens can be found at St David of Wales in Brook Green, at St Clotilde's in Stratford, and at St Bibiana's in Haringey. At St Cornelius's in Mortlake, the butterflies are killed when they hatch and are added, alongside their predecessors, to a taxidermy board that is stored in the crypt. The earliest inclusions to this macabre display have rotted away to desiccated fragments, leaving only dried out scraps of abdominal tissue clinging to the mounting pins. At St Lidwina's in Bondesbury Park, a green-berried variant of the tawny holly, developed by the Victorian horticulturalist Bill Wilkerson, is favoured over the common red-berried strain. The wood-framed garden at St Wilfrid of Ripon was broken open in 1987 and was used to seed a proposed wild area of the graveyard. When I visited the church in the summer of 2020, this overgrown northwestern corner was overrun with Devil's Coachall's beetles. In Tolworth, another wood-framed garden at King St Oswin of Daria has remained on public display, but is no longer used for its intended purpose. It has fallen into disrepair to the extent that it is probably no longer salvageable. Where did these gardens come from? As the Reverend Hayden speculated, they are pre-Christian in origin. As far back into our nation's fog-bound past as we are able to perceive, there is evidence that symbiotic groupings of flora and fauna, so-called oming clusters, were a commonly tapped source of spiritual symbolism. The curated living theatres that cling to the walls of our churches in diminishing numbers likely have their provenance in the medieval period, though they only really crystallised into their present form during the 1700s. As I was preparing to leave the church, I asked Sylvia, "What does the garden mean to you? Do you mean the Garden of Eden in the Bible, or our little representation of the garden?" "Either, I suppose, though I think mostly the one we've just been looking at. It's a reminder that we are all prone to temptation and to being led astray. But repeating biblical allegory year after year with the same result, surely it's a little depressing." There was what might have been a momentary flash of anger behind her eyes at the mention of biblical allegory. "Ah," she said, "but you have to remember that after the butterflies are cast out of the garden, they rise into the heavens, in spite of the weight of the knowledge they carry on their wings. So really, the garden is a reminder that salvation in the eyes of God is always possible, no matter how far you think you've fallen." We said our goodbyes. Sylvia returned to her snow shovelling. As I was about to round the corner wall of the church, she called out to me and waved. In that same moment, a bus rumbled past, drowning out her words. I raised my hand and waved back. The arched entrance to the vestry was locked. I removed my gloves and forced the damp £20 note between the tight rows of bristles that lined the interior of the cast-iron letterbox. My free hand braced itself against the door. Under my palm, I felt the swollen welts of broken arrowheads, soundly embedded within the grain of the heavy timbers. A legacy of William Greenhell's Protestant uprising of the late 1700s. I have been Sam Redlark. Next time, on London, Building by Building, I will be keeping to a religious theme, as I examine the Skyline Prison in Shadwell, and its connection to the Diocese of Rochester. I will take an inventory of the current jail population, and explore the campaigns for and against the abolition of this 600-year-old Lancastrian throwback. Until then, goodbye.